Well, yeah, thank you. We had the chance to listen to some nice talks yesterday, and they were in English. And we chatted up the speakers yesterday, and they agreed to come here, so we switched to English. And switched the title as well, because now it's Talking Futures and not Inception Revisited anymore, but the Zukünfte, the futures, are still apparent in the title. Our office is called Raumtaktik, which translates to Spatial Tactics, with a subheading, Office from a Better Future. And we're trying to explore possibilities of futures and the city, our future cities, of cities in the future, of past ideas of future cities, and so on. And this is basically what our lecture will be about, and it will just show a couple of examples of how we try to approach that very different or very difficult problem of talking about something we all don't know very much about. First of all, one problem which is inherent when you talk about futures is on the left you have a picture of Metropolis from the 20s, and on the right you have two screenshots from what is it? Minority Report from 2002. And obviously there hasn't been much change to it. So I guess one of the biggest problems we have to deal with is that our idea of future doesn't change as much as time changes. And so at least the pictures of what we think will be the future stay quite the same. Yesterday we had a nice talk by Jeremy, whose title was, I think, Talent Borrows, Genius Steals, something like that. And he was saying, well, yeah, we don't have any industry in the future because everyone will print everything in 3D in his home. And he said it like that is going to happen. And somebody sitting next to me was talking to his neighbor. He was like, yeah, he could have been talking like 100 years ago about the end of commercial airplanes, because everybody would have a jetpack and be flying on its own and not using commercial air travel anymore. So I guess that's one of the things we always have to think about, that the ideas of our future might not be so original after all. This is something which I particularly like, because it's an idea of a future that is not intended as an idea of a future. Some people would call that utopia, and that is actually, I don't know who had the chance to see the screening of Utopia London yesterday. That was actually a very nice and well-executed movie about the ideals of something that couldn't be built. That is Berlin. It's the non-stop airport at Station Zoo. You can see the actual station there, and Sergius Rugenberg actually proposed to build an airport on Hardenbergstraße, and you see the big what is it, Autobahn going there. And the idea actually was, in the war, the Soviets used a strip along Tiergarten as a landing ground, and he proposed, well, Berlin is a city which can't be a city any longer, so we have to find means of transportation to get everyone out as fast as possible. And so he proposed to put an airport like right in the middle of the city to fly everyone out to some other place. Of course, that was only the beginning of a discussion what to do with the very center of the city. But yeah, thank you. That's great. Let's fast forward as I not planned it. Okay. But next, please. Okay, with all this preliminary talk, this is just, we had the chance to write an article about exactly what I was trying to talk about right now in this book, Utopia Forever. And this is current ideas of the future, which are basically just a repetition of what has happened before. And yeah, now we will at least try to start explaining ways of how to get out of this itself repeating future history.
Well, we show some example from an earlier project I did in 2008. It was an exhibition happening in Venice at the Architecture Biennale called Updating Germany. And that is a big exhibition place. All the countries represent their nations there in their pavilions. And normally it is a kind of a show of best practice examples. But in 2008, the idea was to show things that were still ahead of time and some very far and some very soon happening, but would all be updates to current conditions. And as you all familiar with computers, normally you know updates from software, and it means that you get some bugs removed and sometimes new tricks, new functions, but sometimes it's also a complete new setup, a new system where it's based on. So it can be radical changes, but it can also be minor changes. But often it's to the better, but very often also there are new bugs included, and sometimes it's actually also to the worse. And so I think it's very important also for architecture and urban planning to not believe in one kind of utopian idea as a master plan that you can have a straight line into, hence the title Updating. And so the question was, it was updating into a better future. And what is a better future? And I show some examples to just give you, that's from a different, well, it's from the architecture world in a way, but it's not really about building. It's more about how to live in the built environment, or the lived-in environment, as we call it. This, for example, is it's a bunker, a shelter from the Second World War, Flakbunker in Hamburg. And it is a very sustainable building because it sustained actually the war, and it sustained the dismantling after the war, and it's still there, and people cannot get rid of it because it's so much concrete. It's possible, but it's very expensive and complicated. And so it's still staying, and now the idea is to convert it into an ecological center, and using the thick walls to actually store energy in it. So it will be filled with a water tank, and warm water can be stored in the bunker, and it's also decorated with some solar panels, and it's becoming like an ecological center of for Hamburg, for the IBA Hamburg. And so, but it's a good example, I think, for the idea of what updating could mean. So it's something already existing that can be brought to another level at some special problems. Because one of the central questions is, how could we live after oil? And there is ways. For example, maybe some of you have seen this. This is the ideas for big updraft solar power plants in the deserts, where you have huge areas covered with glass, and then heat is produced and coming up these chimneys and produces energy. It's a concept by Jörg Schleich. And there were architects like Christoph Barlieb, who took this idea and developed a whole city concept underneath such a glass shelter, because in the end you only need a thin layer of these glass panels to create the necessary warm air that goes up the chimney and, well, by turbines is turned into energy or power. But underneath there could be a completely artificial environment, and so he calls it the green desert mine. So that could be also an update to a couple of problems and ways we live in. But also staying with energies, if we talk about how the landscape will change, we call it the post-fossil landscape. There might be the idea of we still will use coal to produce energy for a while, hopefully not too long, but for now we still do. And but normally it is big companies digging out the coal for 50 years and later having a big hole and then thinking about, okay, what can we do now? And then they start to make lakes out of it. But if we think ahead and already imagine the hole becomes a lake later, then we can also change maybe the pattern of excavation and where the ground that is taken off is put. And it's an amazing idea for landscape designers to suddenly really become, well, they really can model the Earth in a way, because they can make up height differences up to 400 meters, so it's real terraforming, and it's amazing options that normally a landscape designer would never have. And in this case, it's about a little village called Elsdorf. Elsdorf, it's close to Aachen, and Elsdorf was about to be half removed because the coal is underneath Elsdorf or close to it, so they wanted to relocate the whole village. But then this architecture team of Brandelhuber and Büro für Konstruktivismus had this idea, maybe we can think about a slightly different path for the big bugger and spare the village and tell the village, okay, maybe you have to suffer for a couple of years, but then later there will be a big lake next to you, and you can really already imagining having a marina, being a tourist center, having sailing boats and so on. Unfortunately, it will take about 100 years until you have the first sailing boat. So it will be like 30 years of excavation. Then it takes another 30 years until enough water is actually naturally, or like by the rivers, flowing into the big hole to fill it up, and then you can have this nice marina. But they planned it, so this is the old plan, and we have to think in the extreme long-term view. And this would be the new, different plan. So you have this huge lake, and you could have a marina. And the mayor of the city was so happy about it and convinced that he actually renamed his village into Elsdorf upon Lake, Elsdorf am See. And I think he already bought the internet address. And he has a website. Maybe you can already rent or reserve a place for your boat by 2100. But overall, it's the question: how do we want to live? And I mean, that's all options for the future. None of them will become reality like this. We know, so because we cannot predict the future, but we can imagine different futures and maybe influence which one, or in which direction the reality will go. And this is another example of an office from New York, Holwig Kushner Architects, that thought about maybe the next step is actually a different technology. It's about genetically modified trees. Because we already, we do like genetically modified corn and so on. So maybe the next step is that we actually find out how photosynthesis really works and modify trees into growing over houses. And trees are fascinating because they produce energy by solar energy, like solar energy with water and the sun, and they transport the energy in their structure. And also, so in the structure, it's energy flowing, it's water flowing, and you can climb up on trees. So it's basically all you need to actually make a house work. And in this case, this new plant, the power plant, that's a kind of word of game, it's a power plant, called in this metropolis, would grow over the old city and completely provide all the services you need. And then you can have these pods going up the trees around it, and water, energy, and so on is coming into every floor of the, in this case, like typical American downtown city. And so, as I said, it might be a technological, biological innovation that we cannot imagine yet, because like internet was a very kind of big step, and everything changed since then. We have mobile phones and so on, and we don't know what there might be other new things that will also completely again change the way we live cities. And some we might see, but we don't know which one will be the really important ones. And so, but that was in 2008, and it was a collection of very interesting projects. But we still had the question. It was an open project, 100 ideas, and we completely clearly said that it's probably there are thousands out there, and we need many more. And that's the last one. And now what? But there was also the question. We had projects for a better future. But what is a better future? Maybe it won't be better anyway, and it's also kind of unclear for whom it's better and what does it mean. So we asked a lot of people that we hoped would know how the future would look like, philosophers like Sloterdijk and like politicians like Cem Özdemir and scientists from the PIC, from the Climate Change Institute, and from all over the place, and asked them how they imagine the city and the lived-in environment will look like in 2100. And that is a completely unscientific question, and for some of them first didn't want to answer is because they can maybe think about, even also we would say you don't know what's really going to happen, but they make predictions about how the city is going to be in 2030, maybe in 2050, but 2100 is completely out of scale. But the good thing is then they start to fantasize and have all these crazy ideas, and it was very interesting to see that it's kind of very diverse in what direction the future can go. And I think it's very important to collect these ideas because they're all perspectives from the now into the future. And of course, none of them really talks about what is going to happen, but it's a very interesting starting point of imagining. And in this book, there are a lot of illustrations that will follow us now, done by Lale Tourabi. And here you see, well, that's coming from the interviews, ways of how we could live on the sea or in the city, a bit dystopian. It's also very interesting that in a country relatively running well, like Germany, most of the future visions turn into be horrible visions very soon. In other countries, that is very different. And then we come to the central project. It's called Talking Futures. It's your turn now.
Thanks. I wouldn't call it that central, though, but it was a really nice project. We had a lot of fun doing it. It's a very small book. It's really very small. We sent it out as a Christmas gift for people to hang on the Christmas tree. And since we wanted to find means of explaining to people that there's probably a lot of different futures ahead of us, we designed it as a language, as a dictionary for different future scenarios. So in that little book, there's little phrases of and statements which you might hear or which might come in handy if you travel to a certain future. Before that, we introduced it by a little text which was called Futures and Utopias, which hopefully put in rather logical meaning what I was trying to explain in the beginning. And the interesting thing is that we organize them. I mean, still, the future is not more original than the present, so I apologize if something is kind of shallow. But we try to anticipate these different futures on different scales. So this, for example, is on the streets in a post-fossil world and what you might hear on the street. The first one is actually taken from a project we did in Bangladesh, where the future looks kind of grim, but if you ask people about a future, it kind of looks very optimistic, so the exact opposite of what Matthias was just saying. And the first one is, I wish the bees wouldn't be so loud, implicating that the city of noise has been lowered so that the ears become so sensitive again that you really, are bothered by the bees. Nice car sound, can you copy that, is probably a very now statement. As you have ringtones for your phones, that would be the tones for your future car. And the last one is, what a mess on the street, so many people, which of course implies that you really have a public space for people to attend. If you look at dystopian ideas, probably of any age, you always have a very vast and car-centric and not very people-friendly environment. On a side note, we always try to put it in reference to what we saw in Bangladesh, because that was the backdrop where we started to develop these scenarios. So on the left, you always see pictures we took when we were in Bangladesh. This is actually just some slum settlement where we went on the rooftops and were shocked and made photos in awe, I guess. This is nice as well. The zoo of gene manipulations. So there's actually a very kind of funny world where you go to the zoo to see transgene organisms or cyborgs, or where the lions have been extinct for quite a time, and the Swiss Army knife has actually become an organic thing as the tree Tropolis we had before. And, well, that probably stands for itself. That is just kind of a very, no future or Generation X statement about what will come in the future.
Yeah, that's not the end yet, but it's just the beginning again, because we tried to learn from you at the conference, and we would like to continue with this dialogue discipline of having translatable or maybe only one language statements about the future. And so we already published some of them also on the local Twitter wall. And so if you have this hashtag of Talking Futures, there are some, and we would like to ask you, if you want, you can send us some more, and maybe we can we have the Talking Futures going on and collect the whole big book, like a dictionary of Talking Futures. Maybe you have realized that we talked about futures and utopias in plural, and that is also like a crucial point, because normally it's one future that you can imagine, but of course with all these ideas we know that is only a perspective from the now into one optional future that we imagine, but there are many more. Every one of us has a couple, and then if we connect them, we have millions and thousands. And maybe the word utopia has lost a bit its energy, and that's also a problem of, as we saw yesterday in the movie Utopia London, it was a dream of the 60s and 70s, 50s of an equal society, and that was not really fulfilled with in the 80s, as we saw in the movie. And maybe then also with the end of the real existierender Sozialismus and the war coming down, all these political utopias were not really, well, you couldn't really talk about them anymore, because they produced so many wars and death and problems and so on. But I think in the last years, with all the crises coming up, it has kind of come back. But maybe, as we say, we should think about it in a plural, and then we maybe can take off some positive energy of it, because all these ideas will not be the one solution that you need. It's maybe an update. It will have new problems, and you have to reiterate and rechange it later. And it's really important to be aware of the fact that there is no straight line into the one future. So it will not, like, from the one point, and then you have this vision that it could be like this, it won't be the one way. And I think a lot of the utopias that failed had this idea. They tried to realize an utopia, and that won't work. And that is a nice picture of Marshall McLuhan, and he already had this idea that he said that normally if you look into the future, we look in a way into rear view mirror and see the past and try to continue the past into the future and trying to be on the road. And there's always this one vision also, if you would imagine you have only the rear view mirror, but the front view is blacked out or taped or closed, and then you would try to steer the car forward by keeping on the street looking into rear view mirror. That often works quite well for a while, because most streets are straight. But then suddenly there is a curve, or maybe there's some other object on the street or some problem, and then it won't help anymore. And that's why it's very risky to believe in the prediction methods that are usually used by politicians or leaders of companies that try to, it worked once, it will work for a while and continue. And unfortunately, actually, it does work for a while, but at the moment, it doesn't work anymore. There's no ideas what to do. So for us, it's important to develop these scenarios to be actually able to react in case something unexpected happens. And this, that's another example of this idea of looking back. It's an image by Klee. Maybe some of you have seen it. It became really famous. It was drawn in 1920, but already in 1921 it was bought by Walter Benjamin. And he wrote this text. This is an English translation of originally German text about the Angelus Novus. That's the title of the picture. He called it Engel der Geschichte, the angel of history. and maybe I read it to you. A clay painting named Angelus Novus shows an angel looking as though he is about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned toward the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make the whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. And the paradise was also the image of the book title you saw in the very beginning, so that was the idea of the updating Germany maybe. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. And that led us to a project that we, with all this knowledge about that we don't know about the future, how can we imagine, and how all this history has already piled up and brought all these problems, but we still try to look into the future, and especially Berlin is kind of full of history. And these are two quotations that you probably know, and that were kind of, well, they failed. Or maybe they were also not honest when they were saying it. But that was a start for a project we did in November with the magazine Arch Plus, and they have a new issue on Berlin, and they were asking us to have a structure of what could you imagine, how will Berlin be in 2050? And there's so many options how it could be. And we had a workshop with experts from many fields, mostly though academic, not like, but that's often the case, you cannot have everybody, but from different disciplines, thinking about options for the future. And we created a kind of the method of scenario planning, ways of how Berlin could be. You want to explain something?
Sure. I mean, the method scenario planning is very common. It comes from the military, and it basically tries to make sense of a very over-complex world. Berlin, as our case study, was of course a very over-complex place for us because we're one subjects that actually move through the city. We have our visions for the city, and so we try to gather a group of people that had some involvement with Berlin and would think of alternative futures that wouldn't be so obvious for Berlin in the first place. We came up with these 4 options. We named the entire project Optional Cities because it's basically not what is going to happen to Berlin, but what could happen to Berlin. And as you can see, we have Berlin Blade Runner, where the Berlin icon destroyed the world, so that is obviously not a very good world. Then we have Berlink, which sees the Berlin Bear playing with the world, so Berlin has become a global player in a sense, I guess. The Berlin Think Tank Stelle is obviously a quite gripping play on words, and kind of tries to take what Berlin is now to the next level, in a sense that Berlin has been a place of experiment and that it will be a place of experiment, always on the brink of disaster. This is why the globe already has a little crack. And on the very left low, we have fundamentalicities, which actually made Berlin into a lot of different cities that don't really interconnect any longer, but live or coexist. And so we have not one bear, but we have different bears that have a different, well, actually too many halves of a globe. But anyways, it looks nice. Yeah, that is fundamentalicities. As you can see, we have Apple Town, we have the Alpinists on the hill over there, we have the socialists, we have some Japanese enclave, we have some knights over there, some pirates, we have a communist enclave. And we have a lot of satellite balls which kind of interconnect the different parts of Berlin to their actual belongings to the countries where they kind of reference to. That is fundamentalicities. You want to do the next one? Think Tank Stelle. Think Tank Stelle is what the group we work with probably wants Berlin to be. So there's the wishful thinking in a very progressive sense as well. Berlin as a experimental field for things and for lifestyles. And so we have like these different structures that evolve around existing structures, temporary things. We have a lot of nature back in that we have a reference of many different historical levels. We have old lamps and so forth. That is the Think Tank Stelle. The Berlin Blade Runner, well, the city is trashed here. The bear really can't do anything any longer. We have a lot of Gaia. I don't know what Gaia is in English. What is the birds in English? What? Vultures? Really? Oh, great. So we have a lot of bad birds in the city. We have a dystopian view on the city. We have Black Hawks controlling everything. We have huge, almost flying police cars. And we have a lot of people actually leaving the city. I just realized I can look down here as well. And the last one, that is probably one of the biggest threats the creative community is presented with in Berlin, is that Berlin actually becomes one of these homogeneous places where eco-technology and other businesses really found a way of investing in the city and making the city a Singaporean like place where everything is controlled and might be wealthy, but still might be a very controlled place and a very homogeneous place. You see all the people feng shuiing, no, what is it? Not feng shui, but some martial art, some peaceful martial art doing it together. Tai Chi probably. And yeah, and the investors flying in with their helicopters to see if the city is as they proposed it.
Yeah, and I think you kind of see that that the visions are mostly a bit dark. And as I said, when you go to Bangladesh, where you really imagine that could be really bad in the future, they have really positive ideas about the future. And I think clear is that all of these images are not the ones that will be realized. It's more our fantasy or our state of hope or optimism or pessimism at that moment that you can see in these images in a widespread way. So we have some key factors that we tested out in a wide range. And of course, there are many more images. There can be millions. But hopefully, these kind of images can help us to actually decide and work on the future. Because as we said, we cannot predict it, but we can help shaping, designing the future. And I think a conference like this here is also doing that all the time and imagining different options and publishing about it and talking about it. It's also about, in a way, that if we know, if we have an idea of how the city could be, and if we want to participate and shape it, we have to do so, and we have to find ways how to do that. And I think that is sort of one kind of more analog way, in a way, of creating these ideas. But there should be a big community, and I would be really happy if we could start with you also, that we started today this Talking Futures project in the end to add more fantasies and dialogues of how maybe you could talk to each other in the future, indicating a certain state of being in the future in these dialogues. Thank you very much. So we have a little bit of time left, so if there are questions, welcome.
Only big question marks and then we have. Do you have
Do you personally have an idea of the Tempelhof airport project?
Of the Tempelhof? Well, I guess what I really liked was the idea with a bug, obviously, to put a very high, steep mountain on it. Not in the sense that I would promote having a big mountain on there, because that's probably very impossible to do over the next 100 years. But what it did was it had a lot of people that weren't interested in the place before suddenly talking about it. There was a lot of cafes all over Berlin where people actually started hanging up canvases with a little idea of the mountain on the Tempelhof field, and that changed the public discourse about what was going to happen with that field. And in a sense, that was a way of democratizing a discourse that was as specifically or typical for Berlin would before be only discussed within a very small in-group of people. So I guess that was a very, good urban intervention to do.
Any questions? Okay, thank you. Have a nice conference and send us some dialogues of the future.
Thank you for presenting.